Welcome to People, Power, and Politics. Hard talk, riveting interviews, community updates, in-depth analysis. That's People, Power, and Politics. We tell it to you as it is. No holds barred. You are the people, you have the power. We bring you the politics. To listen to our show, be a guest, or to advertise, visit www.pppradio.nyc. That's www.pppradio.nyc.
Since founded in 2004, Fit in Two Worlds has brought the work of immigrant journalists from communities across the U.S. to public radio, podcasts, and online news sites. Joining us today is Fit in Two Worlds executive producer and founder, John Rudolph. Welcome, sir. Such an honor and pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Pearl.
You're very welcome. So, can you share the journey of founding Fit in Two Worlds and what inspired you to create a platform specifically for immigrant journalists and journalists from communities of color?
Well, Feet in Two Worlds, as you said, started in 2004. And so I want to take you back to what was happening with immigrants at that time. It was only a couple of years after the attacks of 9/11, and immigrants were facing a wave of discrimination. There were attacks against immigrants, physical attacks. There were verbal attacks. Immigrants were, it was a particularly challenging time for immigrants in this country, and especially in New York, which is, of course, where the attack on the World Trade Center occurred. But there was also hope because there was a bipartisan effort in Congress to pass comprehensive immigration reform and to really correct many of the problems with the nation's immigration system. And there was really a sense that this was going to happen, that Republicans and Democrats, especially in the Senate, would come together and forge a new immigration policy. Now, of course, that never happened. But in the midst of all of this, I wanted to produce a documentary, a radio documentary about new immigrants in New York City. I am a native New Yorker, and I've always been interested in immigrant experiences and my own family's immigrant history. And so I wanted to find a new way to tell the story of today's immigrants. And I'd been working in radio and in public radio for many years and producing documentaries. And so working with a group of my colleagues in public radio, we came up with this idea that we would recruit journalists who work for publications like yours, Pearl, that serve immigrant communities, but who had little or no experience in radio. And we would train them to be radio producers. And then their stories would become the centerpiece of this radio program about new immigrants. And the program was called Feet in Two Worlds, Immigrants in a Global City. So we produced the show. It took almost a year to produce, and we recruited 3 journalists, one from the Haitian Times, one from the Polish Daily News, and one from India Abroad. And none of them had ever done radio before. And they produced these 3 wonderful mini documentaries that went into this hour-long show. And the program was a big success. I mean, it was broadcast on public radio stations all over the country. It won a bunch of awards, but then something surprising happened. One of those 3 journalists was offered a job at WNYC, which is the largest public radio station in the country. And his name is Arun Venugopal. He is still there today. He's one of their senior reporters and is well known to public radio listeners not only in New York, but across the country because he has guest hosted a number of national shows as well. He reports on race and justice for WNYC and a number of other topics as well. But when Arun was offered the job, everyone who had been involved in producing the program realized that we had done more than just made an hour of really great radio. We had created a pathway for immigrant journalists to come into the public radio system and to lend their voices and their expertise and their perspectives to a medium, to a channel that was overwhelmingly white and had an overwhelmingly white audience. And so that's where the idea for Feet in Two Worlds as an organization began, and that's where Feet in Two Worlds really started.
Okay, so you mentioned your immigrant background. Do you want to share some of that with us?
Oh, sure. I mean, my I'm a I guess I'm a third generation immigrant. My grandfather on my mother's side came to the U.S. In the very late 19th century from Ukraine. He was a little boy and he grew up in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And then my other grandparents came from, I had a grandmother from Lithuania, but she was born in this country. And my grandparents on my father's side were both born in the US, but they were from families that had immigrated from Germany.
Okay, great. So, what has been some of the significant milestones or achievements for Fit in Two Worlds during your tenure as executive producer and founder?
Well, we started as a small organization and we were very much focused on New York. Originally, Feet in Two Worlds was based at the New School. And now we are today a national organization with journalists and producers and editors really all over the country. And then we also have a network. So the way Feet in Two Worlds works is we offer fellowships to journalists, and we also do shorter training programs in weekend intensives, and we offer internships to journalism students from immigrant backgrounds at colleges and universities across the country. And so over the years, over the past 2 decades, quite a few people have gone through our programs. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people have gone through our programs. And now there is this really incredible network of Feet in Two Worlds alumni who work at news outlets that serve immigrant audiences and news outlets that serve mainstream audiences. And this was nothing that I ever planned or even imagined, but all these people stay in touch with each other and they help each other and they've created this kind of professional network that is they support one another and they help each other with their stories, or they help each other with finding jobs, or with working through work issues or journalism ethics issues. And it's this really wonderful group and as I say, a network that has become its own thing. And I'm very, very proud of having helped to lay the groundwork to create that.
Okay, so, we spoke about Fit in Two Worlds starting in 2004, and it's now 20 years, 2024. And things have changed in some ways, but in some other ways, not much has changed in the way immigrants are being viewed and treated. How has Fit in Two Worlds evolved over the past 2 decades, and what role do you see it playing right now, given what is happening in today's media landscape?
I think what we've done is we've allowed, or not allowed, but we have created the conditions for journalists who might have had a very, very hard time entering the media landscape or entering media or news organizations. We've paved the way for them to go into those organizations and bring their ideas and bring their perspectives. And I remember hearing a story from McElveen Neal. So she was one of the original three Feet and Two Worlds immigrant journalists who worked on the documentary that I talked about earlier. So
Mhm.
McElveen at the time was a reporter for the Haitian Times. She's now, I believe, their executive editor, but she took a long circuitous route to get from reporter to executive editor. She left the Haitian Times and then she went to work for a newspaper in South Florida, and she was the only Haitian journalist there. I think she might have been the only Black journalist on their staff. And she tells these stories of how she would be sitting at editorial meetings and they would be discussing police interactions with members of the Black community or members of the Haitian community in South Florida in very let's just say insensitive ways, maybe racist ways. I don't know. I wasn't at the table, but this is the way she describes it. And just her being there and being able to say, "Do you understand what you're saying? Do you realize the implications of the way you are thinking about these stories and the way you're thinking about the people who are the subjects of these stories?" It actually helped to change that newspaper's editorial procedures in terms of how it covered the Black community, the Haitian community, and how it covered interactions between those communities and the local police. So I think that there have been lots and lots of examples of that, of people from Feet and Two Worlds former fellows going into news organizations and changing the focus of how they covered the news.
And that's very important. So, what advice would you give to aspiring journalists, immigrant journalists, and journalists from communities of color to, looking to break into the industry?
Well, as you know, the news industry is in a crisis. We're seeing all of these legacy outlets laying people off, reducing their staff. Um, some of them, many of them, I mean, lots of newspapers have just gone out of business. Um, but I also think that because of technology, there are opportunities. I mean, anybody can start a news outlet. Now, that doesn't mean they can start a good news outlet, but there are lots of opportunities to tell stories, to cover the news in new and interesting and innovative ways. And one example I can give you is a organization that we helped start at the beginning of the pandemic. So I was introduced to a Mexican journalist in Arizona named Maritza Felix. And I was trying to figure out at the beginning of the pandemic how Feet and Two Worlds would respond, how we would cover the pandemic. And she was a freelance journalist based in Phoenix who was also trying to figure out how she could help serve the the Latino community in Spanish with news about COVID, because there was a lot of COVID misinformation being shared, especially on social media in Spanish, not only in Arizona, but all over the country, all over the world. So she started a WhatsApp group, and she would every day she would post um, information that was scientifically verified about COVID, and she would push back against many of the myths that were being circulated on social media to Spanish speakers, and it was really kind of a it was a it was a it was a long shot kind of a thing, but she was using WhatsApp. She wasn't using traditional channels. And today, Connect to Arizona has its own radio program. It has its own website. It has its own podcast series. And so, what Maritza has demonstrated through that journey is that you can use some of these alternative channels and some of these alternative platforms to create a viable news source that's trusted, that is respected by its peers, and that has real impact on the community. So I guess what I would say to this is a very long answer to your question, but I would say is um, be open to new possibilities and
Think
be
outside the box.
think outside the box. That's right. Because there are opportunities there, and there certainly is a need for reliable, relevant journalism. We're seeing so many outlets fail, but that doesn't mean the need isn't there. It just means that the the financial model of journalism is failing. It's not the need for journalism is still there. It's just figuring out the money part that is proving very difficult.
Okay. So how do you envision the future of Fit in Two Worlds under the new leadership?
Well, I actually I'm not going to answer that question because I feel that I mean I'm still going to be involved as an advisor, but I want the new leadership. So starting on April 1st, I'll be stepping down, and Mia Warren will be taking over. Mia's a former Feet into Worlds fellow. She actually started at the very beginning of the pandemic as our first editing fellow, and she produced the first season of our podcast called, excuse me, A Better Life, which looked at how COVID was impacting immigrants and immigrant communities and changing their ideas about whether they could achieve a better life in the US. But Mia has a lot of ideas about where she wants to take the organization. And I think I'd rather have her um, follow her vision and her dream rather than imposing mine on her because it's time for new leadership and new leadership needs to be able to lead.
Okay, that's fine. So finally, what's next for John Rudolph? I know you said you take on an advisor role, but stepping down from Fit in Two Worlds, how do you plan to continue supporting diversity and inclusivity in journalism in other capacities?
Well, I am absolutely dedicated to the idea that we need to center the voices of immigrants and people from communities of color in journalism.
Mhm.
And so I don't like to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion as much as I like to talk about centering, because when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially the inclusion part, it's what are you including people in? Are you including people in the existing structure and asking them to conform to what has already been established? Um, I have some issues with that whole terminology. Um, but I think that the impulse behind it is to um, is to give people whose voices have not been heard a voice and to let the to create the conditions where they can reach their full potential as journalists, as opinion shapers. And so I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to be doing other than being an advisor to Feet into Worlds, but I'm sure that I will be able to, there will be places like this interview where I'll be able to speak out and offer my opinions. And hopefully there will be other organizations that I can speak with, be in dialogue with, and help them achieve their goals in terms of becoming more inclusive and more reflective of the communities that they serve.
Excellent. So how can one learn more about Fit into Worlds?
Well, go to our website, fi, the number 2w.org. And in fact, next month, April 2nd, we'll be launching the latest season of our podcast. We've got some really wonderful episodes coming up. So the name of the season is Home Interrupted, and it's about climate change and immigrants. And so we have some couple of stories from New York and then stories from other parts of the country looking at both how immigrants have been specifically impacted by climate change, but also about how immigrants have become, in some ways, leaders in the effort to make the world a more sustainable place and to find solutions to climate change. So, for example, we have a story about how Maya immigrants from Central America are bringing their ancient agricultural practices to Nebraska and helping to, or hoping to, revolutionize the unsustainable agricultural practices in that heavily agricultural state. We also have a story from New York about how immigrant kids on the Lower East Side are helping to redesign playgrounds to make them more resilient to heavy storms and flooding. So there's a whole wide variety of stories. And so if you want to, I invite everybody to come check out Home Interrupted on the Feet into Worlds website.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Rudolph. It was such a pleasure and an honor speaking to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
People, Power, and Politics. Hard talk, riveting interviews, community updates, in-depth analysis. That's People, Power, and Politics. We tell it to you as it is. No holds barred. You are the people, you have the power. We bring you the politics. To listen to our show, be a guest, or to advertise, visit www.pppradio.nyc. That's www.pppradio.nyc.